This is the Yoakum Strength Podcast. Take the leap down the rabbit hole with us as we interview elite level guests to unravel what high performance really is.
Oh, Aaron, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So we just got done chatting. You might possibly have the coolest backstory that we've ever gone over so far. You just mentioned, you brought up your story through here, but do you want to tell the listeners kind of a little bit about yourself, kind of where you're at now and the journey to get to where you're at now and the thought processes that has brought about?
Yeah, so it's been a kind of long run. I didn't even think about this. I come from a medical family. So my dad's a doctor, my mom's a nurse. My oldest brother's a speech therapist. And then my middle brother's an FBI agent. So he's like the black sheep. He's kind of weirdo. When I was younger, I was always interested in the body, interested in the medical field. I thought I was going to be a doctor. Went through undergrad, did all the MCAT prep. And then like my spring term, right before I was going to graduate, I was like, I don't want to be a doctor. And hit a little crossroads there. And one of my friends, she said, she's like, you would like being a PT. I think you would enjoy that. So I volunteered at a clinic, watched a little bit of it. And I decided like, yeah, that's what I want to do. And at the time I was coaching football at high school level throughout undergrad. Had always been kind of teaching like movement or be interested in movement, or especially like the analytical side of it. And so I shifted gears and tried to get into PT school, which I was able to do. And my whole thought process during that time is like, I'll go into athletics. That's what I want to do. The other stuff I'll just learn about, but then I'll go into athletics. And then I was in graduate school and I did my first like neurological class and rotation, meaning working with people who had strokes or spinal cord injuries or brain injuries. And it shifted my perspective completely because, I grew up in the football world, played basketball and football mainly, did a lot of the meathead workouts, right? Like lift heavy, power cleans, heavier you go, the better. And not really looking at how am I improving myself as a mover, which looking back, I was not. So I got stronger, but I was not making myself a better athlete. Maybe just by pure will, I got more athletic, and time. But I think I moved better when I wasn't lifting weights as much. So I started looking at the neurological world and got really interested in that. And so after grad school, I did a 9-month residency and in Vallejo, which was proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, which is PNF for short. And what most people know about PNF is contract, relax, stretching, which is like such a small piece of the puzzle. It's like saying, you know how to change a tire and therefore you're a mechanic. In turn, I was working with people who had primarily brain injuries or strokes, and for 9 months there, got mentored by incredible therapists, 20 plus years experience, have taught around the world. And I started looking at how people move from a developmental standpoint. So if you take a person who can't walk from their brain injury, how do you get that person to start organizing themselves differently? How do you help them really make sense of nonsense in a sense, or people, we get tons of stimulus all the time and we filter out a lot of that. So if you had a brain injury, you tend not to be able to filter out all the different activities going on. For example, right now I'm talking with you, but there's light coming in from the window. There's maybe sounds from outside. There's temperatures, all the changes in the air. All these things are happening. Our brain filters those out so that we can focus on what is at hand. And with a person that's had a brain injury, that becomes a lot more difficult. So how do you get through to that person? How do you help them start putting pieces together to start even rolling over, sitting up, walking? And for me, I started looking at athletics isn't really any different. It's just at higher speeds, more force, but the learning process isn't different. And so I started thinking about, how can I take an athlete that's still interested in athletics? How can I get them the awareness of the missing piece that they have, and make them potentially aware of habits that they do that isn't in the forefront and maybe holding them back. So I did neurological rehab for about 5 years. And during that time, I was also getting trained in a method similar to Feldenkrais method. Did that as a 4.5-year training. And then from there, eventually moved to Santa Cruz. I met Austin Einhorn, who you interviewed a while back. And then we teamed up together to start working at, I joined him at Pyros, and we started working with athletes from there. And I took my perspective of working with, pretty low, potentially what people say is low functioning, low level. But using those principles I learned to help someone who had a brain injury, help someone who had a stroke, and then starting to apply that to an athletic field. So complete paradigm shift from, get in the gym, do 3 sets of 10 of squats, 3 sets of 10 of lunges, right? Do some power cleans, all to going like, well, how can we get someone to become aware of activities when they're doing their squats or cleans, or when they're playing their sport? How can I make them potentially move differently in a more efficient pattern? It's more about, so looking at the whole person instead of just the muscles, or and probably more importantly is getting people to connect over correcting issues.
And this is where I'm really interested, because it's like, it was almost forced you, your pathway to the athlete, back to the athletic field. So you started athletic field, you went away, and then you went back to the athletic field. Almost forced you to go back to the real fundamental basics of human movement. How can we get this person to move? And a lot of times we are blessed as strength coaches with they move, and the higher up athletes you work with, the better they just do things. And we're never really going back to the basics of these things. We're never looking at it, because we're just seeing phenomenal outputs in front of us, because this athlete already has that. And it almost forces you to go back to those basics. And something that kind of triggered and made me think of this is like, what is causing the disconnect? So when somebody has the disease, or whatever the issue is, where they have to learn how to walk again, and that's who you're working with, we like, you can kind of understand where that issue is coming from. But where are these disconnects coming from an athlete that should be functioning, if you think about like evolutionary wise, like that athlete should be functioning, they should have the connections. Where are these disconnects that you're seeing with these athletes coming from? Why are they coming to you with these issues and with this disconnect? Like, well, where is that coming from? Is it the force strength conditioning aspects of it, or why are we having these issues?
Yeah, and that's like the $1 million question, right? So when I'm working with someone, I'm always I tell them I have a working theory of what potentially is going on, and we will keep exploring why you have that level output, or why you do this. It could be a variety of reasons. They could be from an injury, right? It could be from someone told them to do this. They read it in a magazine. Maybe some athletes, they didn't crawl very much. So I was working with a runner who had a lot of foot issues. And I looked at how his back was organized, and I put him in, crawling positions in a bear crawl. And he really struggled with that. And I just kept on asking questions, found out his parents were like, oh yeah, you crawled for like a couple of weeks and he started walking. So you think, well, that's fine. Like that worked out for him. He's obviously doing things well, but maybe he's missing a component there. And that was just from his developmental standpoint. So we went back and did some more crawling variations of that, which helped his foot, because it's, for me, crawling isn't much different than running. It's the same pattern. So in turn, I guess, again, going back to, I go, what if they're missing something? Can I bring them back to how we learned to move in the first place, which is kids learn to move on their back, on the ground, learning how to control against gravity, learning how to roll, learning how to sit up, learning how to crawl. All that starts really low in the gravitational field. But in turn, I can take away that force of going against gravity and I can up their awareness level. So I take stuff away, but I ask a lot more cognitively. Example would be if, in the middle of the day, if the sun's shining and I turn on a flashlight, you're not going to notice the difference of light. It's just too big a stimulus, too small of a change. If it was pitch dark and I turn a flashlight on, you're going to notice that difference. So I take away some distractions. I take away some gravity field, or even I might stop talking as much. I start using my hands more and let them start upping their awareness at a level where they can actually make a change compared to at like such a high speed where the brain has to go to what it already knows.
And with this, so you're bringing them back, and we talk about this a lot on this podcast. I love that you bring this up because we have all of our football guys. We're starting to get them to crawl, we're starting to get them to roll, we're starting to get them to climb, and you really get to see a lot of things exposed. And you'll see some athletes that are phenomenal movers on the football field that can't do it at all. You'll see some athletes that are bad movers and can't do it, and you just see some of these connections. You start to make sense with it when you talk about bringing awareness to these issues. What is it? Is it individualized? Is it the person, like, does the person always have to come to you with a symptom of like, hey, hip is bothering me, and then you approach them, we're working with the hip, we're going to draw awareness to that? Or is it so we have an athlete that isn't having symptoms yet, but you like, how are you approaching an athlete that doesn't have the symptoms yet and is coming to you just to increase performance, because I know you said the quote is like talking about how the same thing that's keeping you from throwing faster is the same thing that will cause that elbow pain. When you have an athlete that isn't showing the symptoms of pain yet, how are you approaching that athlete and drawing the awareness to what the issue possibly could be?
Yeah. So there's going to be, it's all a spectrum. So I get, having a physical therapy background, I get a lot of people who are coming to me when they're in pain. Hopefully I'm going to keep gathering more people are coming just for performance, because it's easier to ounce of prevention is better than a pound of recovery. But I just look at if they're in pain, it's a matter of how much load am I going to put them on? All right. So how much can their tissue tolerate? Use an example of a thrower, right? So if their elbow's hurting them when they're throwing, it's probably the same reason why they're hovering in the mid 80s when they want to be in the 90s. It will be individualized, because I will look at their movement signature. So what's their sport that they're trying to improve on? How do they move? What relationships are well developed in them? What relationships may be lacking? And injury is always a probability thing. So I don't view any movement as bad or good. It's all context related. But there's certain movements, if you do more often, the likelihood of injury goes up. If you take a squat, for example, your knee's going in when you're squatting heavy, probably not a great idea. Your ability to let your knee go in, very useful if someone's about to kick your knee, you dive into valgus so you don't get kicked in the knee. Very useful movement, right? So it doesn't matter, like the knee going to valgus isn't necessarily bad. Now, what are we doing is potentially bad or good. So when I work with someone, it's a lot of gathering information right away. And I continue to gather information. So any sort of treatment or any sort of intervention is an assessment as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. So you talk about gathering information. Is that so? I talk about it a lot with my athletes, but it's like you're watching an athlete move, and let's say he doesn't have a movement option, he doesn't have a tool. So like maybe it is the knee valgus. He's not able to actually get into that because he's externally rotated his entire life because he's been told to do that in his squats. Is it something like that, or you like? Once you see something like that, how are you kind of diving into an athlete like that? I just bring that up because football guys, you see it a lot. It's been naturally they were able to go into valgus, and they were told it was super, super bad. So now you have athletes that like can't do it at all. And now they don't have the option, like you said, to even do it. And it's good for when we're squatting and you don't want to go into knee valgus, but now you have other movements where that would probably help you a lot to have that option. And now you don't have that. Is that what you mean by gathering information? And then what's your kind of approach once you see something like that?
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad you bring up options. So I'm like, what I'm trying to create is an option for the person, option for their brain, more or less. So if I say, we'll keep using knee valgus as example, I see that, maybe I ask them when they're walking, go upstairs or squatting. I can, whatever activity I'm watching them move, and I keep seeing the same pattern show up. Now I just go, in my head, I go, why is that? And is it, do they just not know? So you can ask them, can you bring your knee in? Maybe they just don't, they're been told that's not a good thing to do. And then we have that conversation about good movements and bad movements and how it's all context dependent. Maybe it's something from a joint level. So maybe their hip is actually stiff. Now, if I look at, stiff in quotes, I start wondering, how's that hip organized to the low back, to the rib cage, to the ankle? So if they come in and say knee pain or hip pain, I'm looking at the whole body, and that may be through me moving them passively through. I could have them actively do a movement, or I may put them in position like a 90-90 side sitting and see how their hip responds. And then again, I'm looking at how their rib cage moves. Most often thing I correct on people is how they're stabilizing their spine. I think that's probably one of the worst things we do as a society is tell people to potentially pull on their stomach, engage the core, or when people are squatting, like squeeze the glutes. I mean, I know I've told all this stuff in the past. Hopefully it's diminishing a little bit. But for me, a stable trunk is one that's actually relaxed and can hold the position with minimal force. So using like children, for example, I've never seen a kid outside, a typically developing kid, pull their stomach in. I've never seen a gorilla pull their stomach in. I've never seen a lion pull their stomach in. But we tell good posture in at least in America is pulled in stomach, shoulders back, and in turn, they're actually stabilizing their spine inefficiently against nature. So it's culturally acceptable, but it's not evolutionarily acceptable. And that will create a cascade of events. And that's probably the place where I start initially, is like, how are they stabilizing their spine?
And with that, so you talk about, because I've heard this brought up a bunch of times too. And let's say, so you want the kind of the options too. So you're going to load up that spine. One, are you staying like, because this is something that I thought about too. Before I was told to brace my core when I squat or did any of that, like I never thought about that. I never had any awareness to it. And I would just squat and I would do up and down and I had no problem. And then I was told when I got to college, like I need to brace as hard as possible doing any lift and like squeeze and do everything. And then as soon as I started doing that, like everything just, it was that combination with always driving my knees out as hard as possible during the squats. And those two things, it just always made the movement feel so awkward. But I was like, oh, I just don't know the movement well enough. I don't know the movement well enough. What is kind of that approach now to, you're trying to organize the spine in like that loaded position? How are you doing that with your athletes? Is it just like, if they're drawing awareness, like if they already know, this is what I'm trying to think about. There's two ways, because you could have the athlete that has no understanding of the brace and they're probably just going to naturally go through it. And that's probably honestly better for you to work with than the athlete that has all these ideas and knowledge in their head. Then are you just talking to them about those ideas, or are you trying to show them, like, what are your kind of cues when they're going through these sessions, that type of stuff?
Yeah. So I'm going to ask them to do what they do already and make it really clear. So if they are used to, let's say they got told pull belly button to the spine, I'm going to ask them to do it, and we're going to go through a series of activities so they feel what that's like. Or I'll ask, or ideally they come to me like with an issue that they have. So I was working with a baseball player recently, a pitcher, and he talks about his hips feel pretty tight. I mean, he has a hard time opening up towards a home plate. So his lead foot being his left foot ends up on the third base side, where ideally it would open up more towards the first base side. He's a right-handed pitcher. So, but he tries to get there. His hip feels like it locks up. He then ends up having like side bend over that left side and drag his elbow through space instead of being externally rotated, which has put a lot of stress on his inside elbow. So I asked him, like, let's see how you stabilize your spine. Let's see, like, what's good core to you, and for him, it was tightening up, pulling in, and which made him rectus abdominis, dominant and internal obliques. I would on where I'm looking for more of like a cylinder throughout the trunk. He was having divots for his external obliques and more or less transverse abdominis. I'm simplifying a little bit, but in turn, so we went on his back, and I said, hey, why don't you just don't let your spine move and lift your leg up and to see what happens. And I was like, just keep it full cylinder like a baby. And then he's like, I don't feel it so much in my hip. I don't feel so much in my hip flexor. So then we went into like, let's get you on hands and knees. Let's do the same thing. Let's do in crawling. Let's do in half kneeling. Let's do in side sitting. Let's do in standing. Let's go through what are other exercises we want to go through. And then in turn, I would go pull your stomach in. Give me like what you normally do. Give me the new one. And as soon as he started going back to his old ways, he's like, man, I could feel all those areas that hurt, my low back, my hip flexors that constantly feel tight. I feel like I need to stretch. I'm just not stretching enough. He's like, those don't feel so tight. So that's where I go, can I give him again, perception of difference is most important for me. And then can we do that through multiple things so that he can own, or not necessarily own the movement, and own the difference, because the brain's idea is perception of difference.
Well, I think this transitions really well into what I want to talk to you about is like you in multiple posts and your Instagram bios, it's like you talk about being a teacher, and you talk about, you said even before this podcast, like you create lessons, not sessions, not like workouts, but you create lessons. And that's something that I wanted to dive into with you, is like in the football world and a lot of the strength conditioning world, it's like we want to create outputs, and we want to create stronger, and we want to create bigger. And the more I look at it, the more I'm like, we should be creating learners, like students and lovers of movement and skill acquisition and learning these things. And like, I really feel like it should be more, and coaches can be a term that works with this, but in the sense of like, we should be teaching more. We should be teaching in the sense of where we're creating a love for movement, a love for this skill acquisition, and creating the environments that allow you to do so. And that's where I think it's a really cool, you laid out your process of, this is kind of how you built out your learning environment for them to learn the skill that you wanted them to do. And you talked about all these different ways to do it, because when you look at it, like learning is super messy, and kind of your approach to being a teacher and dealing with how messy learning really is.
Yeah. So my daughter is about 10 months old right now, which she's been a great teacher for me, watching how much she moves, how much she tries different things. Some of it's just random movement, spontaneous movement, but each time she does something new, or kids in general do something new, it's by accident. They meant to do one thing, they meant to do A, and then B emerges. And then they laugh, or actually a lot of times they get scared because they go like, whoa, what just happened? So the first time my daughter pulled herself up on furniture, she actually got scared because she didn't mean to pull herself up. She was just moving. So it was really messy. And then next time she pulled herself up, she was like, started laughing. Third time, now she just cruises everywhere. So if you look at how we originally move, everything we did was by accident. So it is really messy. We get a ton of excitement. Our brain fires a bunch of neurons, and then we start pruning those back into more and more focused movement. So our brains are information machines. Our bodies are based off the world of physics, but our brain's an information machine. So if I can give the person more information, I can make them and get them better at learning something, actually just get better at learning anything. then they will figure out the best movement for themselves, right? Because there's bandwidth within anyone, right? No one moves exactly the same. You look at, we'll take football example, like there are better throwing mechanics for quarterbacks, but Mahomes plays a little different than Tom Brady, or Aaron Rodgers plays a little different than those two, and they're all very effective. So my goal is to actually make them really good perceivers of differences. Let them kind of figure it out. And the quote I use is like, I always want to be useful, but not necessary. So if I'm feeding them information all the time, what's going to happen when they get to game day, when they don't have a coach in their ear? What's going to happen when say I'm working with an athlete and they go off to college? What's going to happen when they're out there? Are they going to just, for your example, right, get told, hey, pull your stomach in, do all this, like where you start going like, man, my squats feel weird. Not that I want them to not listen to their coaches. They should listen to their coaches, but maybe make them a little bit more self-reliant, going like, well, if this feels weird, I know what a good squat feels like. And maybe I'll give them an opportunity to experiment a little bit. So they go, this doesn't work for me. And then can I find a little slightly different path that allows me to keep making progress?
I freaking love that. I'm geeking out right now about that kind of approach, is like just feeding them information and then seeing what they do with that information, how they learn from that information. And then I think that sets up you as a teacher, your next lesson. Like, all right, they perceive this information this way, and it exposed this weakness, it exposed that kink, whatever it exposed. Now maybe we create another lesson plan to kind of hopefully give them more information on those type of things. And that's something I'm interested in, is your lesson plan. I'm taking your lesson approach and expanding it, but how you build out your lessons, how you adapt your lessons, how each session is individually, and then how you kind of, I want to say program, but I don't want to really say program, but like progress the lessons themselves, and kind of your process of that.
Yeah. So I will typically, if say most of the time, the first thing I ask is what does the athlete want to work on, right? What's important to them. I'd rather have them drive the session.
And is that daily, or is that like at the start, it's like, this is what you want to work on to get better holistically? Or is it every day they come in and it's like, this is what I want to work on today, or a blend?
Both. So like, let's go long-term goal. What's something you want to work on? I'll ask daily, if or I'll tell them, one of my athletes I worked with yesterday, he texts me a couple days before. He's like, man, I was doing deadlifts, something felt weird. Can we work on that? I'm like, sure, let's go for it. Right. That's important to him. It's much easier for me to go like, hey, you want to work on your deadlift? We can work around something, figure out your deadlift. Instead of me going like, hey, we should work on your deadlift. Right. It's much easier. Like, the lesson's easier to teach when the student's engaged. So I'll ask right away, like, hey, what do you want to work on? I'll have plans of relationships that maybe I want to establish or highlight, but so I'll give you just a general. I'll start something on the ground. It may be some sort of rolling, something more towards, again, lower gravitational field. That will be typically like my warm up, quote unquote warm up would be something on the ground. Let's use constraints of position to maybe highlight, say we're going to work on hip mobility. I may be having them roll. One of the things I love to do is have the person hold say they're going to roll to their left, they're going to hold their left foot with their right hand, and they're going to try to roll to their left, which now I've created a constraint by holding the foot that their left hip and basically right shoulder are connected. And when they roll to their left, they have to now go through an external rotation on that left hip with the rib cage to figure out how to come up easily. So that might prep them for, again, rotation around fixed femur. So if we're looking at like a pitcher, where a pitcher needs to be able to rotate their rib cage on a fixed leg to throw the ball harder, we're going to start rolling on the ground. Then we might get up into like a half kneeling, do something where they're now rotating around again that hip, fixed femur, rotating around that hip. Then we might take them up into standing, rotating around a fixed femur with either some sort of resistance, maybe a band, whatever. I might even take like a kettlebell and have them coil over that side. And then we might mimic it into some sort of throwing with like a medicine ball, and then and potentially we may have them actually throw a ball. So now we went from, here's this relationship on the ground. Now we're going to get you up closer and closer to your sport, while the whole time I'm going like, hey, do you see how this rolling is actually part of your throwing? You see how like when you're in half, and that's part of your throwing, so that they connect the dots. So it's not just an exercise, it's actually a movement relationship, and makes it more salient to them.
Yeah. And I think that's amazing. Like you have talked about multiple times the awareness, but it's like every step of those ways, you're transitioning that awareness of that position from the most basic aspect of just being on a ground or rolling all the way to their sport and making that connection with them. I think that has to be super powerful for the athlete themselves to be able to like make that learning process in their own head, rather than just being told to do this without any purpose or reason behind it or connection.
Yeah. Then some of my favorite things are athletes will go, hey man, I was looking at this, and that made sense to me. Or like that rolling thing we did the other day. You see, I got a text where it's like, you see this guy doing a roundhouse kick? It's like the same thing. I'm like, yeah, well, doing a roundhouse kick or throwing a punch is actually the same rotation as throwing a ball, right? But that's not me prompting them. They made that relationship connection. And that's incredibly powerful. So now they're starting to look at the world a little differently from a cognitive standpoint, and then that's going to influence the rest of their body and how they move.
And how are you balancing this out with because I'm sure and I want to go just a little practical sense here. Like you have if let's say you're working with college or professional athletes, you have them going to their either sport practice or their whatever the college strength conditioning sessions that they have to do, and getting kind of broken down and focusing on not the things that they're going to come to you and we're going to have to almost fix a little bit. Like, how do you balance that out? Is it just giving them the information and then allowing them to self-regulate that sense? Are you working with them like remotely? Like, what's kind of your process to balance out? Like let's say you spend, even if it is 4 sessions a week with them, like maybe it's like 8 hours a week with them, they have the rest of the time by themselves. Like, how are you balancing out that approach of like how much time they're not with you compared to the time that they are with you?
Yeah. So it's a really good point. So it is a balancing act. I don't want a athlete we're working with to tell a coach, hey, I'm not doing that because my, so-and-so trainer that they don't know from Adam is telling them not to. Like, that is not a ideal situation, and puts them is definitely, I'll just put it this way. I would not want any of my athletes to ever do that. So if there's an activity that they do with their team, and they don't like it, we try to find the value within it. And what is their movement signature? What can they work on? What can be their focus point when they're doing that activity, so that they find some value from it? Using a baseball example, I'm not a huge fan of reverse throws, where they're, typically people are like half kneeling and they're throwing the ball behind them. It's usually used to strengthen the deaccelerators or the back of the shoulder, which I think it's actually, there's more risk to doing that than you're going to actually, and you're also strengthening the back of the shoulder concentrically. When you throw, it's actually eccentric strengthening or eccentric strength that you need. So I don't really like reverse throws. I would never if I was a baseball coach or worked with the team, I would never have anybody do reverse throws, because I think you're going to create anterior shear of the glenohumeral joint, which already happens when people throw. And if we really were meant to throw backwards, everybody would be throwing backwards. We don't, when we were hunting, when we were hunting lions or hunting animals or deer, we weren't throwing spears backwards, right? We're not, our eyes are forward for a reason. So, but they need to do that. Like, they're going to do that with their team. So what I'll do is, I'm like, don't throw the ball that hard. Don't worry about your arm. Let's think about how your rib cage is turning. So I get like, let's think about your chest bone opening up. So now we're working on hip shoulder separation, and let the ball just go, and don't worry about velocity on it, because it doesn't matter on a reverse throw how hard you throw. Actually, throwing hard might actually stress the shoulder more. But if we can get you to feel your rib cage open up, feel that hip shoulder separation, then that's hugely important because that's about 80% of your velocity on a baseball throw. So in turn, now I'm getting them to take their focus away from the arm, turn it into their trunk, and then they can get some value out of that activity and participate with the team.
And so this is something that triggered in my head then. You bring up the awareness, he's focusing on these things. What happens when you have an athlete that is almost like hyper aware of their body? I have a couple athletes that I know of specifically, like we almost had to break them out of everything they did was analyzed to the point where like every movement they had was so robotic that it hurt. Like it hurt, like I mean, everything they were thinking, you could tell that you could just see that, like, I'm supposed to run this. I'm supposed to have my hands here. I'm supposed to feel this. And obviously it's part of it's like, they're thinking about the wrong cues, some of it, but it's generally they're super hyper aware athletes. How do you approach that type of athlete to where they're not, or to where we're not creating hyper aware athletes? Or is it just because it's the wrong cue? Like you can have a hyper aware athlete as long as the right cues and right thought process. What's your approach there?
Yeah. You get the paralysis by analysis thing. I'm guilty of that myself when I do things at times. So I have like very strong beliefs held loosely. That's kind of how I look at it. So I believe this is a great way to learn learn is developing awareness. But if that person is over analyzing, then we got to change it, because that's not for their habit to over analyze. So I'm trying to create another option for them to be a little bit more automatic. So in turn, I'm going to create external constraint for them. Not that I don't do that already, but I might make it a lot more external and tell them just go. So I was working on sprinting the other day with a person who gets, when he incorporates his arms, it gets really mechanical, doesn't get the good counter rotation with his trunk. So then the constraint was, we're doing some A skip. I gave him a sandbag to hold on to, took his arms out of it, I was like, just skip. And we went, and I tried to like, let's go skip for distance, go as far as you can. But by him holding the sandbag, he started creating counter rotation. Then we put a PVC pipe over his shoulders, so he held that. So now he doesn't have an arm swing, but he has longer levers on each side that created more that helped him get the feel of counter rotation. Then at the end, it was just go, stay low, go fast, right? So I just gave him. I didn't ask him to be super aware of stuff. Like afterward, like he would run, then I would record him. We'd watch how that improved it and what he felt. But then during activity, I gave him pretty basic cues. Or I may have someone like box throw, like if they need to learn how to rotate, I have this handbags, and I don't need to make them a boxer. Give them the bags, that likelihood of them hurting their wrists is pretty low, because if they're not used to throwing punches, you don't obviously want to sprain anybody's wrists. But I might be like, hey, if they hit that bag solidly, it's going to give them external cue back of going like, yeah, that felt good. And you just say, like, hey, punch hard, right? Don't think about it so much.
No, I love that. We do a lot of the same things with our football, with the hyper aware athletes. We do the same thing. And the other part is like trying to add in competition too, because that's something where it's like, it's super funny. You talk about like, it's always the combine athletes that come to us. It's like they've been combined out their entire life, middle school, high school, running 40s. That's always the combine coach that tell them, and they think about all these things. Then he just tell them to race somebody rather than run by themselves. And as soon as they race somebody, all the combine stuff's out the window, and they're running faster, smoother. Some guys it's a little bit tighter, and it's like this, but like usually they self-organize themselves to try and win. And that's when it's like, all right, well, let's look at this. Yep. This is how you run fast for yourself right now. We can change some things, we can do this, but it's not the mechanical robot thing that you were doing before. So like, let's kind of try to get that out of our head.
Yeah, that's great. And like, or another idea that came, like I might have them do something more, play something like that may not seem related at all to their sport, but it's going to make them break them out of their mold. So like even just try and do like a handstand. Right, like where it's like, does a handstand make you a better athlete? Perhaps, maybe, I don't know. It's kind of fun to try, and you'll roll around. You'll make mistakes. Actually, learning how to fall is really good. I mean, I can come up with reasons like it strengthens your shoulder girdle, all these other stuff, but it's so unique to them that they can't really overthink it, because if say they haven't done a handstand before, they have no reference point to try overanalyze that.
I like that a lot. And it's something with the handstands I do too, is we just talk about learning and creating movers. Some of the cool, I like handstands and cartwheels are two things because football guys are notorious for sucking at them. And two, it gets you the buy-in of once you can teach them how to do that, they get addicted to the learning mechanisms of, oh, I can learn how to do a handstand. Like what can I do next? My body wasn't capable of doing this before. Now it is. Ooh, like almost like a little piece of candy you give them. It's like, ooh, like what else can I do? What else can I do? And that's where I feel like we really start to get our athletes to buy into what we're doing, buy into the kind of the learning process rather than the coaching process.
Yeah, I agree. And so that's, again, some of the rolling stuff I do is like, will be unique. Most of the time people, they haven't rolled holding their foot, or I'll have people what I call happy baby rolling, where they're holding both feet like the yoga pose, but then they're trying to roll and to their side and actually do a whole circle with it.
My football athletes hate you and Austin for that. So,
so it's like, again, like you look at a global flexion pattern, it helps external rotations you basically are now making the rib cage the articulating point of that movement. And so it's really challenging for people. But when our other athletes and I were doing like tag through that, he was pretty good at rolling. I'm pretty damn good at that. I'm a short guy, so I can roll pretty well. And him and I were just trying to do tag by rolling around in circles that way. And so like stuff like that would be, it's fun. It makes them move differently. And again, it's so unique. You can't overthink it.
And so I'm interested before, and maybe there's not, but for the sports performance coaches listening right now, we've addressed rolling, we've addressed crawling and getting on the ground. And we've addressed a little bit of climbing. Is there anything else that you think like you can implement like right away with your athletes, or we should be implementing right away with our athletes to kind of get some of these patterns into their daily life that they're kind of missing out on that you see?
Yeah, we're talking a little bit about our climbing. Like obviously Apiros were pretty big on climbing because it's vertical crawling to me. Any sort of different grips using different weights besides a barbell would be huge. So we have some pretty big sandbags. Trying to even just do a regular, press, bench press type activity with a sandbag.
Brutal.
It's so much different, right? But now you're getting that hand into like, say for a lineman who needs to punch out, right? Like, the barbell is not that useful for them, right? They're not going to be at 90s, 90 degrees abduction, pressing out, but their elbows are going to be in. They're going to need to hit with their palms to control that, whoever the defensive lineman. So if you give them a sandbag to press there, now you're going to get better integration because you're going to get a doming effect of the hands, which will usually reflect a doming effect in the diaphragm and the pelvic floor. And they will feel different. They'll go from someone who maybe can bench, 200, 300 pounds. You give them 200, say they can bench 300 pounds. You give them 200-pound sandbag. They're going to be like, whoa, this is hard, like harder than benching 315. Using the kettlebell, holding the actual bell instead of the bar part. Why we like the rock climbing grip so much is doing pull-ups on those, or even if you just got, you don't need a rock climbing wall, but if you got, there's plenty of rock climbing boards that you can install that will have different handholds, and it'll change the integration of their trunk dramatically. And then for me, going back to a little bit before, is getting people not to hold in their stomach, not to pull their shoulder back when they're walking, to actually let their stomach relax so that we get a reflexive eccentric contraction of the pelvic floor when they're walking, when they're doing things in general, or living their life in general, will make a major impact on them.
I love that. A couple of things that you brought up before you got to the core again is a lot of the hand stuff. That's something that I've noticed a lot with offensive linemen, especially in football players, especially, is you start to implement sandbag work, kettlebell work, crawl work, and a lot of the climbing work. And you get to see, first of all, their hands aren't, like you said, you had that 300-pound bencher grab 100-pound, either, especially the kettlebells, but just and crawling too. Like, this dude should have outputs out the butt, and you put him to hold himself in a crawl or you put him to press something where his hand's in a different position and his wrist and hand, like the wrist hand complex completely just collapses on him. And then it kind of brings it up as like, all right, so what does getting that 300-pound bench to 350 or whatever we want to do? Like, what does that do for you if it's collapsing on your hand when you're just holding your body? Like, are you going to be able to transition that to your punch? Is that really doing you any good in what you want it to do you good in?
Yeah. And that's, so the reason why I bring it back to the core is that if they're benching, pulling their stomach, doing those type of things, they will not have good wrist and hand activation because they are inefficiently stabilizing their trunk, which will affect the rib cage, which will affect any other mobile joint like the wrists, like the hips. That would be like a relationship that would be a problem. So part of the reason why when they go into bear crawl, and they would most likely, is that they are not actually integrating their rib cage efficiently enough. So it'll fatigue the hell out of them. They won't be able to even hold themselves up on bear crawl. But to your point, right, a 350-pound bench press or 405, whatever, you can have a high bench press. But if you can't really crawl, is that useful for you when you have to hit a defensive lineman, 70 times in a game?
Yeah, exactly. I think we're on the same page there. I'm geeking out about all this. So, before we get to the rapid fire rounds, we talked briefly about, I don't want to say a cool story, but kind of your story that led up to your approach to stress and what a stressful situation can lead to. Can you dive into that story a little bit and kind of how that has helped your mindset and your approach to stressful events and how it affects an athlete or how it affects the human organism?
Yeah. So about 6 years ago, a group of people broke into my home and kidnapped my girlfriend, who's now my wife, held me at gunpoint, tied me up, charged me a ransom. Eventually she was let go. There's the elevator version of it. It's a lot pretty traumatic, life-altering event. Part of the reason why I actually moved down to Santa Cruz was to get out of the city where I was living before. At the time I was 30 and I thought I had a good job, had a house, had a lot of stuff that you traditionally think like kind of American dream type, and that all got pulled out from me pretty quickly, actually instantaneously. So it was been, I have PTSD from that. Took me a while. I didn't work for 6 months, and it really made me take some inventory on what's important. So when you go through something like that, you lose, you start trimming away a lot of things that are unnecessary. Not that I felt like I was overall doing things pretty well, but it started making me a little more open to emotionally than I was before. I used to think I was very much a person who I will handle it on my own. I won't ask for help. I'm capable of doing it. I don't want to burden anyone. When you go through something that big, you need help. So I'm fortunate that my family and I have really close friends, have an incredible partner that helped me get through that. And in turn, there's PTSD, but there's also post-traumatic growth. And so as humans, we're storytellers. We tell ourselves, we have major events in our lives that we remember, and we can either have a story that negatively impacts us, or we can potentially, through therapy, or my wife and I wrote a book, through writing, we can reprogram that and maybe take something that's terrible into something that's good. And if we look at most athletes or most people aren't going to go through what I went through, but athletes go through something traumatic. Everybody goes through something traumatic. It could be just as much as getting picked on as a kid, or being embarrassed at something, or missing a game-winning shot, doing poor turnover, having a coach who thinks the best way to motivate you is to beat you down. But we can look, so I look at that, can we take for an athlete or just because they're all people, right? Can I help them through potentially my experience, figure out a way that they can rewrite their own script, and maybe a lot of it's their own self-talk. So thing I had to learn, big part was to have my self-talk be like how I speak to other people. So like most people, I'm much kinder to someone else, my athletes or friends, than I am to myself. And not that doesn't mean you're not holding yourself accountable to the actions you perform, but it's also giving yourself a little more leadway than I would typically give myself. And then it goes into, we'll talk about in the rapid fire, some books that I can provide them. And again, helping them maybe, the other thing I would work on is breathing techniques would be another ways to help them potentially control anxiety, or so I meditate often, but try and find accessible ways to do that. So it's not that they have to meditate for 30 minutes or an hour a day, but can we find 2 or 3 minutes to slow down their breath, to be in the moment, to start kind of registering outside of the potential panic that can happen or stress that can happen from things that may be going on, or like the future stresses, and be in the present moment. So I use my breathing techniques a lot, especially if I'm feeling my anxiety levels go up. I might close my eyes and for 30 seconds to slow down my breath and to start to get away from things steamrolling. So those would be kind of real briefly how I would take some of that experience and translate to people I work with.
Well, I think that's so Austin Einhorn actually recommended the book Awareness to me. We talked about awareness through this, but the Awareness, the actual book, and that's where it's like giving yourself that noticing, like you talked about how when you feel that anxiety, you just like you take that moment to notice it and grab onto it and focus on it and breathe through it, rather than the ability to, or not the way of doing it of like you feel it but you don't really notice it and it just kind of runs your life in the background. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot as athletes and coaches, is if we as coaches aren't taking the moment to like dissociate from the moment, to pay attention to these things, I just feel like as teachers we're training athletes that aren't able to do the same thing. They're not able to take that step back from the sport. They're not able to take the step back from even just being an athlete themselves. That's all they are. So if you just want to, and you don't even want to take it to life and the how much it can help you in life. You just want to take it to the sports performance world. You talk about an athlete that has a bad game, misses a shot, strikes out in a game, something along those lines, and their identity is so tied to that bad play, that bad moment, to just being an athlete in general, that they're never able to take a deep breath, take that moment and dissociate from it. Then you have an athlete, just sports performance wise, that is going to crash from there. And you can talk about physical stuff. We can talk about all these things that you want to, but if we don't really address those moments, and there's many coaches out there that don't even do it themselves, then you're going to create a bunch of athletes that are along those same lines.
Yeah, I agree. And so some of it is where I use my breath is actually just to really experience what I'm feeling. So if I'm maybe I'm feeling like a little anxious and I can't quite tell why, I'll actually spend a few minutes and let myself feel really anxious instead of trying to go like, well, nothing's going on, right? Like day's fine. I don't know why I'm feeling like this. And trying to suppress it, I'll go like, let me actually process through it. And then from there I can let it go. So if say an athlete had a bad game, really let them feel that sucks, right? It sucks to have a bad game, and it's okay to go, that's going to affect you for a while, but let's actually go through that whole feeling of it instead of trying to go like, well, it's a bad game, move on to the next one. But the way you move on is actually processing through it and not burying it.
Yeah.
And so, letting it simmer underneath, because example is like it's your shadow, right? It's still influencing you. You might not see your shadow, but it's still around you. So you can either become aware of that and how it's affecting you, and then you can deal with it and you can integrate it.
Yeah, I love that. I geek out about that the entire time. When I read, so Austin had me read Awareness and Illusions, and those two books,
Mm-hmm.
man, that wow, messed me up. They were good ones.
Yeah, I saw your quotes of illusions. I was like, oh yeah, took off the device. I could see. I saw those on your Instagram.
All right, let's transition to rapid fire round. The first one we got is favorite books that you can recommend to people that you think they can get a lot out of.
Yeah. So, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. That's like should be required reading in this country or every country. It's Viktor Frankl was a survivor of the Holocaust, and he writes like it's an incredibly powerful book. And he writes from first person point of view, which he even talks about how originally he wasn't going to do that, but he puts himself in that moment. It's helped me tremendously. I've read it multiple times, or I might read 3 or 4 pages, put it down. It's definitely not a book that you're going to speed through because it's some heavy material, but one of his best, I think one piece I take away from it is talks about like trauma or sorrow being like a gas where no matter what concentration is, it's going to fill the whole room. So sometimes people, they may go like, well, so if I have a bad game, like that's not that big a deal in the scope of things. Right. So you look at like, you can always find someone who's had it worse. You can look at, if you look at the world as a whole, right, having a bad game in a sport isn't necessarily that worth the terrible thing as far as like the stresses that people deal with in the whole scope of things. But understanding that it's still affecting you, and it's still a challenging situation for that person. So I think Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, read it. It will have I think it will have a positive impact on your whoever reads that book. And then another book I love is Gifts of Imperfection by Brene Brown. Or anything by Brene Brown is good. That's helped me a lot with, as I referred to before, as self-talk, and how actually recognizing that your imperfections are, as the book says, it actually can be a gift, or understand that vulnerability is actually a sign of strength. When people think, a lot of times we're afraid that's weakness, but people view it as a sign of strength. Really helpful book in any field, but actually definitely in the performance world. Peak by Anderson Erickson is a great talking about deliberate practice. He's a guy who figured out it's about 10,000 hours to become an expert in anything. Malcolm Gladwell kind of, he oversimplified it. So there's more factors. It's not just 10,000 hours. It's about how you spend those 10,000 hours. So if you want, so in Peak, he talks about basically anybody who's like considered prodigy. If you look at their life history, they were kind of set up to actually be as good as they were at a certain point. So really good way of figuring out how you can apply that deliberate practice to anything you do, and improve any performance. It doesn't matter the modality. So it could be playing music, it could be playing football, it could be a coach, it could be anything. And then the final book, Play by Dr. Stuart Brown. Quote that sticks with me from that is the opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. So he looks at play, he thinks we have a large play deficit in our, especially with adults. So you look at kids learn a ton through play. We don't let kids play enough now, but adults stop playing. And what happens to our brain when we're engaged in play is the biochemistry of it's incredible, but it'll start making you think of like, yeah, I should have a little more games in my life. So those would be like 4 books I would recommend.
Boom. And do you want to recommend, or not recommend, but bring up your book that you have coming out? I just learned about this before the podcast.
Oh yeah. So if people are interested in more about what happened to me and my wife, our book is called Victim F. from victim F, from crime victims to suspects to survivors. It will be coming out June 8th. It can be bought on a major platform, Amazon, Walmart, Target, any of those things. So June 8th release on that.
Awesome. And then next question, and this is one that I really like asking guys like yourself to hopefully drive this rabbit hole of community that I'm trying to build. Who's a guest that you think we should have on the podcast?
Yeah, Andrew Huberman, who's a professor from Stanford in neurobiology and ophthalmology. He has a great, definitely follow him on Instagram. He has a podcast. He goes into neuroplasticity, our brain's ability to change, really good practical information. Even one I've been applying is just getting like sunlight early in the day, being outdoors to start setting your circadian rhythm and trying to watch a sunset. Thing that he showed is like even if you watch the sunrise or sunset through a window, it takes 50 times longer for that to process into your brain because it's getting filtered through the glass than it is to be outside. Tons of good information. Awesome teacher.
Boom. Yeah, that sounds right up my alley. I love that.
Yeah.
And the last question of the podcast, and this is when all of this teaching is over. What do you kind of want your legacy to be?
Yeah, that's probably, I saw that was a tough one. I don't really think about my legacy. I try to keep stuff really process oriented because you can't control outcomes. Maybe it's what I went through before, your life can change pretty quickly. So I just try to, keep the process, try to have a high quality processor and then see what that happens. But I hope people, I guess I'll put it this way. I hope people think about me as someone who tried to improve the world through movement and empathy.
Boom. Well, thank you for being on. This was awesome. We got into some stuff here that I'm ready. I'm ready to go back and listen to. This is sweet.
Yeah, man. I appreciate it. A lot of fun.
Thank you guys for listening. Keep chopping wood.
Thank you for listening. Join us next week as we dive down another rabbit hole. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star rating. Follow us on Instagram at Austin Yoakum to stay updated on future podcast guests. Keep chopping wood.